this is Professor Congleton, and this is Econ 741. This is a lecture that I pre-recorded for the trip I took to attend two conferences. The first recording didn't work out so well, so this is a re-recording of that first lecture. So you can think of this as take two. The purpose of this lecture is to introduce the idea of optimal taxation. So optimal taxation deals with normative theories of taxation, and these normative theories are constructed on various foundations. For the most part, the normative foundations of optimal taxation that are used in economics tend to be utilitarian ones. That's to say, we try to imagine how much utility is lost from all taxpayers, and sort of add up all those utilities, if you could do that. And we can compare alternative tax systems that we might impose that generate the same revenue with the amount of utility lost from taxpayers in each of those, under each of those tax systems. So, and the idea being that the ideal tax system would be one that gathers a given revenue, whatever that amount might be, at the least loss of utility when added up across all taxpayers. Right? So we know, ignoring the services that are being purchased, that removing income away from individuals or raising the prices of goods and services in various ways, that all tends to make consumers worse off, and the more worse off those taxes make consumers, the higher the burden of taxation can be said to be. So we've already been using tools like this when we talked about excess burden, when we were looking at taxes in single markets. And the idea of the normative tax theory is you want to take that idea or ideas similar to that, those sort of excess burden ideas, and apply them to systems of taxes that might include effects on more than one market. So for example, an income tax affects all kinds of labor markets. An excise tax system affects taxes on lots of different kinds of services. A value-added tax affects the value added, the profits and losses associated with production when that production takes place in a decentralized way, and value is added by a number of firms that ultimately adds up to a final good that consumers pay for at the store or at a dealership. So the utilitarian framework is convenient because we already think in utility terms, and if you could imagine being able to add up utility functions, it's not crazy to think that this would be a way to think about the true burden of taxation. There are issues with that measurability assumption that we'll talk about later on, but most of welfare economics is grounded in these utilitarian ideas, and optimal tax theory, for the most part, has been grounded in those same ideas. So there are two ideas about optimal taxation that we're going to go through today. One is the idea of an optimal excise tax system that developed by Ramsay in the early 20th century. And the other is an idea of that's sometimes called tax neutrality, or the economic defense of broad-based taxes and taxes that have relatively few loopholes. And so to do the Ramsay taxation, we're going to look at this diagram to look at the effect of broad-based taxes over taxes that have various loopholes and exceptions and exclusions. And we'll be looking at this diagram. Now, for you students watching this video, you'll want to copy these diagrams down in your notes as we go through it. And so as I start to talk about the diagrams, I suggest that you just pause this video and jot down the diagram and jot down basically what the purpose of the diagram is. As well as, of course, outlining my lecture as I'm kind of developing it here in front of you. So at the time when Ramsay was writing, many tax systems around the world generated most of their revenues from excise taxes of various kinds, including tariffs, which basically are similar to excise taxes but imposed on goods as they come in to a nation from other countries. This diagram is constructed to illustrate a particular point, which is essentially it's the logic behind the Ramsay ideas of taxation. So what I've done is I've constructed two markets. Market 1 has the black demand curve and the black supply curve, and the equilibrium price before the tax is imposed of right where those curves cross, and an equilibrium outcome, which I've labeled as Q star 1. The blue lines characterize market 2. It's a market that has an equilibrium sales quantity of Q star 2. And you can see by looking at the diagram that the slopes of the demand and supply curves for market 2 are flatter than the ones for market 1. And that means that that market 2 is composed of suppliers and firms that are much more sensitive to price than those supplying and purchasing goods in market 1. I've constructed the diagram so that both of this excise tax, the same excise tax imposed on either market, generates exactly the same revenue, namely T times Q prime, which is the area of this rectangle. If you look at the diagram, you can see that if I impose this tax, which is this height, this per unit tax of amount T per unit, on market 1, you will move back to the left until demand is exactly $T above supply, and that will create an equilibrium sales and output level of Q prime. The deadweight loss from such a tax on those two markets is this triangle here, right? Which I've labeled DWL1. You can think of it as the excess burden if you want. If I impose the same tax on market 2, I also find that the result will require the demand curve to be $T over the supply curve, and you get exactly the same output in the end, and the same tax revenue from imposing the tax on market 2 instead of market 1. However, if you look at the deadweight loss from imposing the tax on market 2, you can see it's a much larger triangle. And the other measure of deadweight loss, how much the market shrinks, is also quite a lot larger. Right? So we have this reduction in output and sales from market 2, and a somewhat smaller one associated with imposing the same tax on market 1. So the Ramsay idea is you want to assign taxes in a way that minimizes deadweight loss. And so if you're choosing whether to tax market 1 or market 2, you would tax market 1 using the Ramsay criteria, right, rather than market 2, because you have a much larger deadweight loss, a much larger tax burden associated with market 2 than with market 1. And so the rule of thumb is that you have relatively higher taxes on markets that are not very price sensitive, and relatively lower taxes on markets that are highly price sensitive. And if you do that systematically across all markets, the result, at least according to Ramsay's mathematics and others who have followed in his footprints, is a tax system that has a lower tax burden overall than one that would, say, for example, had the same rate of taxation across all markets. So it's a clever idea, clever kind of analytical structure, and that approach made complete sense back when Ramsay was writing, and excise taxes were the dominant source of revenues for many governments. A similar kind of logic could be used for income taxes, right? You could look at markets, labor markets, which were relatively more price sensitive and have lower tax rates imposed on them, and markets that were relatively not price sensitive and have relatively high taxes on those sorts of markets. So the same intuition can be used to think about income taxes, and the same type of geometry would apply, right? If if this were just two different markets for labor instead of two different markets for final goods, we would again prefer to have the tax T imposed on the market that was least price sensitive, namely market 1 in this diagram. And that shift in emphasis, or from one type of tax system to the other, only requires relabeling the axis a bit, right? And instead of the Q's along the bottom axis, we'll put L's there for labor supply, labor sales, that kind of thing. And subsequent work in the Ramsay area, which started to be worked out in the 70s and 80s, focused more attention on income taxes. Although it was often the case that those models assumed there was just one type of labor market, or the labor markets were entirely homogeneous, which is, of course, a kind of silly assumption. And a bit odd that nobody complained about that, actually, as that market, as that literature was being developed. So at this point, we want to talk about some normative issues that have come along with the Ramsay taxation. So the markets where people tend to be least price sensitive tend to be goods that have that are necessities, right? So you're going to have really high taxes on necessities and relatively low taxes on luxury goods, goods that you can easily live without, or goods for which there are really quite good substitutes available. And the idea of putting really high taxes on, say, emergency drugs for certain kinds of deadly diseases, or on eyeglasses, like these, we're like almost blind without them. At least the whole world is a bit out of focus without them. It just seems normatively unattractive, right? In effect, it would violate the normal utility ideas that we have in our head, because taxes in those markets, high taxes in those markets would tend to kind of reduce our utility a lot. Right? Our satisfaction with life would fall a lot if we couldn't get life-saving diseases treated, and we all us nearsighted folks wandered around bumping into things all the time because we couldn't see what was going on, or being unable to read signs or look at lecture notes and things of that sort. So, although from one perspective it looks like the Ramsay tax systems, do minimize losses from taxation, that's partly because they're focused a little too narrowly on a particular geometric representation of utility, and one that doesn't really seem faithful to the way utility as we understand it actually operates in a lot of markets. So although this is a very popular line of normative tax theory, when applied to goods that we often worry about, you can see that there are some issues. Right? Why should healthcare be taxed more heavily than cotton candy or something of that sort? Okay, the next type of normative tax theory we're going to look at, it's one that's at least is constructed in a relatively more normal way, a relatively narrower way, more of a partial equilibrium analysis than the Ramsay effort tries to be. And what this diagram here demonstrates, and anybody who's had undergraduate public econ or public finance has seen this diagram before, because it's it's basically a core part of our understanding of tax systems. Even though the diagram is a little complicated, it's not that hard to draw, and not that hard to figure out what's going on. If you try to mathematize this one, it's really quite hard to get the math to give you an intuitively looking kind of result. Whereas the Ramsay tax system is pretty tractable mathematically. It's not that hard to write down what should go on in the way of tax rates for different types of markets. You just basically need a mathematical representation of deadweight loss for every type of market, and you just minimize deadweight loss across markets by allocating taxes to raise a given revenue level. Right, so Ramsay was an early mathematical economist, and his work was kind of pioneering both in terms of this concept and in terms of the math to illustrate what that tax system would look like. The case for neutrality and broad-based taxes is geometrically kind of interesting. I'm a fan of geometric tools. They often are clearer than the mathematical equivalents of those tools, although not always the case. It's not always the case. So let's talk about this diagram. So we have two goods, good 1 down here, good 2 on the vertical axis. And we're assuming the consumer in the pre-tax environment has W dollars to allocate between the two goods. So the initial budget line is this one, right? And this is standard budget constraint. W equals P1, Q1 plus P2, Q2, where P1 and P2 are the pre-tax equilibrium prices for the two goods. And we draw in an indifference curve that's tangent to the budget line somewhere and label that 0.1. Right? That tells you how much the person would purchase if there were no taxes, and no excise taxes, no other types of taxes on this particular market. And illustrate the problem associated with relatively narrow tax base supported tax systems. We impose a tax on just one of the goods. As a consequence of the tax, the price for consumers goes up. It's about the equilibrium price. And that means that the highest amount that a person could buy of that good is smaller than it used to be. So in this case, we impose the tax on good 1. That causes the budget line to kind of rotate around and become this second budget line here. Right? As a result of that new, smaller opportunity set, the consumer purchases at 0.2, another place where his indifference curve is tangent to the budget line, now a smaller, more restricted budget line than before, with a little higher slope because of the higher price of good 2. Of good 1. And so the burden of the tax on the individual in terms of utility would be the difference between the utility of this first indifference curve and the utility realized on the second indifference curve, right? So we can measure the burden of the tax on this individual in utility terms, as utilitarians would like you to do, I suppose. Or you can also try to figure out how much money is effectively being shifted from this person under the tax system. Now, if you, to demonstrate that the tax system has an excess burden, you compare the tax system where good 2 is excluded from the tax base to one where it's included in the tax base and subject to the same tax system. Now, the tax system could be an excise tax on each of these goods. It could be a general sales tax where the same tax rate applies to both types of goods. Or it could be an income or wealth tax. It just takes from W a certain amount, T%, and lets you spend whatever's left over on however you want to across goods. All three of those tax systems will have budget lines associated with them that are parallel to the original budget line. They're neutral with respect to relative prices. They don't alter the slope of the budget line directly, at least. And as a consequence, whatever budget line you'd be on, it would be parallel to the original one, okay, rather than have a different slope. It turns out if you extract the same amount of revenue from this person under that tax system, it will be a specific line parallel to the original one. Namely, it will be parallel to the original one and cross and pass through 0.2, right? The second place, the place where the indifference curves were tangent to the second budget constraint. And this blue line here characterizes such a line. Right, so this blue one actually crosses the second budget line at 0.2 and is parallel to the original budget line. And it turns out that if you select a point along that line, you will have paid the same amount in money terms in as taxes. So in money terms, you're still losing the same amount of income. However, because you don't have this relative price effect, it turns out that you can reach a higher indifference curve. And so if you look, you can see that because the new blue line crosses the budget line at number 2, it's going to cross the indifference curve at that point too, and allow you to reach a somewhat higher indifference curve. And the highest indifference curve that can be reached under the new budget line is along this blue indifference curve, which is tangent to the new line, the new budget line, at 0.3. So the excess burden in this case is the difference between the utility of this blue line that goes through 0.3 and the black indifference curve that's tangent to the second budget line. So that geometry demonstrates that a tax system that has lots of loopholes or exclusions tends to have a higher burden on taxpayers, other things being equal, than ones that treat all income sources the same way, or all purchases of goods the same way as with a sales tax, or that is essentially a more or less flat excise tax system. Okay, one that doesn't distort relative prices. So notice that that insight differs a bit from the Ramsay insight. Because in the Ramsay insight, you really don't want to have uniform taxes. But this logic kind of argues that you end up with a lower excess burden if you have a uniform tax system than if you have a much more complicated tax system of the other variety that Ramsay is arguing in favor of. In both cases, the geometry kind of supports the solution that the idea being kind of demonstrated. And there's a bit of a conflict between the two diagrams. And I suppose it's because this diagram is characterizing net benefits, this one is characterizing utility gains and losses. And there's although the two ideas are really closely related, they're not identical. Now, there are other defenses from neutrality as well as the one that is being illustrated with this diagram. You might argue that it's fair in some sense. It doesn't focus the burden on any particular sector of the economy, and therefore it tends to have a more uniform effect on the welfare of individuals who are working in different industries. It's also a tax system that tends to be easier to understand, and so fiscal illusion should be lower under that tax system than one that has different tax rates for every product or every type of labor that you could imagine. And it's informationally easier to understand, right? If you have basically a flat tax that applies to all purchases instead of 1,000, 10,000, a million different tax rates on all the different types of goods sold in the economy. So there are other rationales that would defend sort of broad-based, relatively uniform taxes over the Ramsay system. And there is a tension among theories of optimal taxation as a consequence. They're not all identical with one another. So one of the things I wanted suppose you have three kinds of taxpayers, and there's Group A, Group B, and Group C, and we just write those down as a triple, okay? And suppose that the amount of cost being paid in to cover the expense of a particular government service is represented by these numbers. So in a sense, all three players, or taxpayers in this case, are paying essentially the same rate of taxation. They have the same cost share. So if you think of these as three people or three groups, essentially the three people or three groups are dividing up the cost equally. Now suppose you propose a different tax system, something that looks like this. All right, so we raise the tax. Well, let's make this one go down a little bit. So we raise the tax on Group A, right, to 50%, now paying 50% of the cost of the service. And we lower the tax somewhat for Group B, and we're now paying 30% instead of 33% of the cost of the service. And we lower it still more for C. You can see that there would be majority support. So we call this 1 and this 2. You can say that 2 is majority preferred to 1, right? 2 out of 3 voters would favor the second tax system over the first one. We can do that again, same kind of thing. We can now make this a we suppose we just change the burden a bit between groups A and B. We lower it for Group A and raise it for Group B. So now it's 45, 35, 20. And that still adds up to 1, fortunately. You have to double check. So number 3 is going to be majority preferred to number 2, right? Because Group A is better off and Group 2 is no worse off. Maybe we should make them a little better off so they feel happier. Let's make it 19 and make this one 36. All right, so 45, 36, and 19 will add up to 1 still. And Group A is better off, Group C is better off, and Group B is worse off. Okay, so it's 2 to 1 again. But again, it's clearly a majority agreement to move from System 1 to System 2, and you get majority agreement to go from System 2 to System 3. But if you look, you can also see that 1 is majority preferred now to 3. So you get what's sometimes called a majoritarian cycle, like as a kind of intransitivity and majoritarian orders. The way most people present this feature of democratic decision-making is as a kind of rather weird property of preferences, and you can come up with examples of preferences that where this type of pattern exists. But notice that in the case of taxation, instead of worrying about voters with rather oddball preferences, this problem emerges because it's a dividing the pie game, and people's practical interests, which are very ordinary economic interests in trying to maximize their net income, for example, generate such cycles basically automatically. So one reason to pay attention to normative tax theory is that if we think of the practical interests of voters, they may not be very stable. There may be no median voter in the system, okay? Because of the way you can divide cost shares up among individuals or groups. And it just turns out that every cost share you can imagine will be majority dominated by some other possible division of the costs. And you can muck around with these numbers. You can see there's all kinds of possible ways to do this. So this little cycle of 3 is just a short illustration of the problem. And so one explanation for why we don't see cycles of this sort, or at least not big cycles of this sort, in well-functioning democracies is that there's something about the political institutions that goes beyond majority rule that tends to block some of these types of alternative divisions of payments. So this is the institutionally induced equilibrium literature, which was started by Shepsey and Weingast back in the 80s. So it's actually a quite important idea. Another possibility is that voters don't fully understand the options when they vote, and there's a kind of error term associated with their estimates, and they vote to some degree randomly at the margin. And depending on the way you model that random voting, it turns out that stochastic voting models can be more stable than the more deterministic, narrowly self-interested, rational choice type models that we've been using in this class, and which are most faithful to the standard neoclassical approach to human decision making. So if you look at the various papers on the reading list by Stan Weiner, you'll see that he and his various co-authors nearly always use stochastic voting models. And they use a variety of stochastic voting models that eliminates the cycle, or at least eliminates most cycles. There's a nice paper by Gebhard Kirschgassner that shows that these cycles exist even if you use stochastic voting models without some assumptions about the way voters' probabilistic voting actually operates. Okay, so some models are more stable than others, but it's not stochastic voting itself that solves the problem. It's a particular subset of stochastic voting models that has this nice property of reducing the probability of cycles down to very, very, very small numbers. So next time we're going to come back and talk about why normative interests might be one of the reasons why we avoid the cycling problem, or at least that the cycling problem is constrained to a relatively narrow subgroup of taxes. It does turn out, by the way, that if you look at American income taxes and the whole tax system, the income, private personal income tax, the corporate income tax, that those tax laws are adjusted every single year. So even though there are rarely big changes in the tax systems, there are often lots of small changes. And so the small changes we do observe are consistent with this cycling problem. But fortunately, most of these kind of cycles are constrained within a fairly narrow range, so they don't completely make it impossible for voters to be able to guess what's going on in terms of their taxes this year or next year when they make their personal private plans, which are often affected by differences in tax rates that they anticipate for the future. So with that, we'll end today's lecture. Basically, there are 2 points. One is that voters may have normative interests. It could be that talking about the normative properties of different tax systems can persuade them to favor one kind of tax system rather than another. Although, to be truthful, most people who write about normative theories of taxation assume that the taxes are just created exogenously. They're not part of the political system. And rather you have some kind of taxing authority that's delegated the power to set taxes pretty much as they want to, and it's staffed out entirely by utilitarians. Okay, that's of course normally not a very reliable assumption, but nonetheless that's the framework that a lot of the optimal tax theories are based on. We're going to talk about another possible set of normative ideas that might induce voters to vote or voters to favor particular tax systems in a way that avoids or mitigates at least this cycling problem. And we're also going to talk about optimal tax theories where both the demand side and the supply side of the market are dealt with simultaneously. I believe we mentioned one of those last time or the time before when we talked a little bit about Lindahl taxes and how Lindahl taxes can generate a potential consensus about levels of a pure public good that might be provided. So that's all for today. I'm back to live lectures after this one for the rest of the semester, as far as I know, unless some strange things happen, some illness or a new COVID lockdown occurs. And so that's all for today. Thank you. Bye.